Hi, everybody. My name is Conor Bredin. I am an indie author. I am a podcaster and I'm a teacher. And actually, I'm in charge of the library in my primary school that I work in. So this is I'm ticking all the boxes.
So many boxes, so many boxes. We're going by first name because last name just then gets complicated. But next up is Deirdre.
Hello, I'm Deirdre. I work as a librarian for Dublin City Libraries. I'm an avid reader. I read a lot of books every year. I started off reading at the first proper fantasy or science fiction I got was actually a set of C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe box set, which I got at the age of 7. And I've been reading it pretty much ever since. It was the beginning of the end, really, for everybody. And I have lots of opinions about genre and categorizing genre.
Yeah. And we'll hear them all.
Oh, yeah.
And next up, we have Fabio, who I am quite envious of because he's joining us from Rome, where he's had a lovely coffee.
Yes, hi. I'm originally from Brazil, from São Paulo, and I'm living in Rome right now, where I'm working as a university professor. In addition to that, I'm a translator. I've been translating lots of science fiction books and some from fantasy and horror since for almost 30 years now to Brazilian Portuguese. Names like Neil Gaiman, Clive Barker, William Gibson, and so on and so forth. I'm also a writer and have a few titles under my belt in Portuguese and in English. The latest being, don't know if I can do this right now, but it's Love and Archaeology by Luna Press. It was published last March. And I never mentioned this in my bio, but I also had a used bookstore 30 years ago. So I was a bookseller too.
I'm including myself in the panel, really just want to go to the pub and talk about libraries and bookstores, or at least I do, but enough about me. We're also joined by MaryBrigid today too.
Hi, I'm MaryBrigid Turner. I'm currently running the children's department in Hodges Vegas, Ireland's oldest bookstore. I've been a bookseller for, longer than I care to remember. I probably started out as a school librarian, being disgruntled at being told to stop reading at lunch. So I went and spent all my lunchtime in the library. Similar to Deirdre, I think my first introduction was The Chronicles of Narnia. And yeah, lots of opinions about genre as well.
Whereas we could talk about primary books and the Chronicles of Narnia and my emotional scars for my parents refusing to buy it for me when I was in primary school, but that's not what we're here for. We're looking at the perceptions and the limits of genre and how publishers and marketers put books and readers into these boxes for convenience. But before we even get into the real sort of serious stuff of this and how it might benefit or how it might limit us, I actually am going to say, what about genre to each of the panelists? Did you have a favorite genre when you were young? Do you have a favorite genre now? Have you fallen in and out of love with genre? And I'm going to mix it up because why should you be prepared with who we're going to start with? And we're going to start with Deirdre first.
Well, I suppose when I started, really, I didn't realize what genre was until I was going to some of the secondhand bookstores in Galway. And I found that the books that I was interested in happened to be in certain genre, in certain labeled areas. Some of them, though, were in other places because they were more popular and therefore weren't really of that genre. Because why would books... why would you have the good books in the genre that they were supposed to be in? Good in inverted commas, of course. I've mostly always been a hugely fantasy fan. I do occasionally dip my toes into science fiction and stuff like that. And the first two authors that actually I was introduced to after C.S. Lewis, the first two major authors I was introduced to were Andrew Norton and Emma Caffrey. Anne McCaffrey, she would tell you most stridently when she was alive, wrote science fiction when she wrote the Pern novels, and she would get rather upset with you if you suggested it was fantasy. And the story that I read that was by Andrea Norton was the Witch World series, which is a alternate world series and actually still stands up fairly well. But I mean, that also introduced me to the idea that really genre was kind of a bit fluid, that you could think of it as one thing and then have it as another. I drifted a lot into urban fantasy before it became completely occupied by vampire romances. And really liked things like Charles DeLint and stuff like that, who wrote like stories that were fantastic and based in our world. I also read the stories that are supposedly historical fiction, but are really kind of fantasy in historical Regency romance is one of my big areas. And that's what kept me sane throughout the entire COVID-19 thing, was because that was a nice predictable genre where nothing really horrible happens to anybody apart from the bad guys, and everything is all happy and cozy at the end of the story. So I suppose, you drift in and out and through these things, and then somebody like Mary Robinette Cowell writes a fantasy series that's actually set in Regency romance, and you're kind of going, actually, this is really, really, this is all of my jam. Please send me more. Unfortunately, they don't write enough of the stuff
they don't. I spent a while describing Doctor Strange and Mr. Norrell as if Jane Austen had written a book about magic.
Yeah, but I didn't like Doctor Strange, Mr. Norrell as much as I like Mary Robinette's take on the entire thing.
It's okay.
No, but I also think literature is a genre of its own.
I think,
and some people fall into will really read that and really enjoy it, and some people just bounce off it like a hard thing. Yeah. I'm one of those people.
I think literature probably is definitely a marketing genre. Where literature begins and ends is really fluid. But let's ask Fabio. What was your gateway drug to genre?
Oh, my gateway drug to genre, and when I was growing up in the 70s, we didn't have much science fiction in Portuguese, translated in Portuguese. So I think it was the big three. Asimov, Clarke, and Bradbury in Brazil. Our big three here. Heinlein wasn't much translated by then. Then in the 80s, I started to read Heinlein. But right after that, my taste shifted a bit to Frederick Pohl, James White, Robert Silverberg. Silverberg became a big favorite of mine. For a while, I could only read Robert Silverberg's stories. But when cyberpunk appeared, I was absolutely enraptured by it. So I started reading everything I could put my hands on William Gibson, Bruce Sterling, Pat Cadigan, and I started looking out for female writers as well, because we didn't read much female writers in genre in Brazil, and except Mary Zimmer Bradley and with Mrs. of Avalon, for instance, or Anne McCaffrey occasionally. But then I started reading more and more. And I don't think I've ever fallen out of love with science fiction. But there was a moment in the late 80s, and I started reading fantasy due to a friend of mine who started borrowing me books. So I had fantasy or fantasy science fiction. I started reading John Crowley, Little Big, which was amazing. And then a bit of Gene Wolfe, but Gene Wolfe is someone who defies genre barriers. And I'm 2 years ago, I did a major rereading of Gene Wolfe's work for Tor.com, because I'm really a big fan. And to this day, I still read lots of science fiction, but I started reading also a bit of noir and supernatural noir. Another thing I was in love with was the Sandman's Limb series by Richard Kadrey, which I really, really like. And I'm also thinking of doing a rereading for Thor or some other venue that's accepted.
Conor, what was your gateway drug? Or do you have a gateway genre you push on to people?
Oh, good question, because being a primary school teacher, I often, kids will often say to me, oh, I don't like reading. And my response is always, no, you just don't like all the books you tried to read. And I'm sure MaryBrigid will agree with me, being a children's bookseller as well. So for me personally, it was fantasy. It was majorly fantasy. Like Deirdre and Mary said earlier, it was the Chronicles of Narnia really got me going. And for some reason, even though for a lot of people, it's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but for me, it was The Magician's Nephew. That one really got me for one reason or another. And it just really, what I like to say now is, the further a book can be from my reality, the more interested and the more fascinated I am with that book. So then as I kind of grew up and the Harry Potter books started coming out, they kind of became everything to me. And then Orson Scott Card's Ender Saga, as well as the Shadow of Ender Saga as well, like all those books just really, so science fiction, that was my entry to science fiction. Now, however, as an adult reader, and anything, I'm happy with anything really, as long as a book is really good. I'm very happy to read it, which I know is it's a bit of a cop-out when we're talking about genre, but I suppose the thing is now that as an adult reader, I don't go to the genre section. I go to just what book calls out to me, whether it be in the LGBT plus romance, or it be the memoirs, or it be science fiction or hard fantasy or whatever. I'm very happy with anything.
MaryBrigid, let's hear about your gateway drugs, or what you're pushing on to the unsuspecting Dublin public.
I was thinking about it as people were talking, and for me, there was two main authors that I remember vividly reading as a child. And that was Enid Blyton with the Famous Five, Secret Seven, Adventurous Four, and as mentioned by everyone else, Narnia. And I think for a long time, those have always been, crime and fantasy have always been my two genres. As I grew older, probably I moved more into reading. I discovered Tolkien. I also discovered Agatha Christie around about the same stage. So kept on with that crime and fantasy. And then discovered people like Anne McCaffrey, and discovered the Dahlia series as a teenager, which completely blew my mind, her Rowan series. And that, I think, was the thing that kind of made me realize that I love science fiction as much as I love fantasy. And the whole telepathy and just the joy, discovering these unknown places. But if there's one that I would always push, if it's got a dragon in it, it's a good book. And I kind of tend to, I read a lot of kids' books at the moment, partly because there's some really good stuff being written, partly because it's my job. And it's usually, whatever the last good book I read is usually what I'm pushing. And at the moment, it's a debut novel called Murray and the Night Brothers, and it's a mixture of both sci-fi and fantasy, and it's really beautifully written, but it's also fast-paced and fun and adventurous and magical and mysterious, and having that all in the same book was just amazing. And things like, but crime would still be a strong one as well.
I think, and maybe we're preaching to the converted, though maybe we're not. I think everybody here is very passionate about books, and I find that people who are passionate about books will read outside of where perhaps they started, and just who knows where you end up, and you end up in some very odd places. But That's another story. You think, but I say that about us, and maybe I'm generalizing. Do you think readers actually realize the boundaries between genres exist? And if they do know that they're there, do they understand why? And do they like them or don't they? And we'll start again with you, Mary, because I'm already talking to you.
I don't think they realize how much we're restricted by them. People come in and they look for example, someone like Ben Aronovich, and they're quite surprised to find that he's in science fiction and fantasy, or they look for Margaret Atwood and are very surprised to find that she's not. So I don't think the readers are as aware of the boundaries. They're very aware of genre, but I don't think they're aware of how limiting it can be at times, particularly in a bookshop or a library. Because sometimes the cover design or the description that's put on a book very much just dictates where it gets put. And it might be completely misleading to what the story actually is. Going back to the Ben Aronovich's ones with the rivers of London, particularly the first covers, they had a map of the river and the London scene. So some people thought when they first saw it was a travel book. Why would they want to pick up a travel book? Until you start talking about it, and then they realize this ain't travel.
I would have thought that the dripping blood would be the travel.
You see, I can actually see it, and I think they've got a bit of a retro crime sort of feel about it. There is something about how publishers put out books to try to attract certain audiences, but we haven't gotten there yet. I'm gonna ask Deirdre because she's chimed in, and then I'm gonna go look at Conor, his thoughts on, how aware are the readers?
In a library, you have to be very aware of where the borrower will go for a book.
Yeah,
it's the same in a bookstore. But we don't shelve J.D. Robb nor Roberts's in Death series in fantasy and science fiction, even though it's set in the near future. It's a police procedural. It's actually basically science fiction, but nobody's going to look for it in science fiction. They're going to look for it if you have a crime section, or they're going to look for it under general fiction. The same with Margaret Atwood. People don't actually go to the fantasy and science fiction section to find it now. If we have two copies, say, for example, of two different editions of The Handmaid's Tale or something, we might shelve one in science fiction and one in the general fiction. But even then, that's kind of, then the borrowers would expect to find more of that in there. So you kind of have to try and, meld it. But I mean, Stephen King falls into the same trap sometimes, I think it is, where he's sometimes shelved as horror, and some of his books are not horror. So you actually kind of have to know what the book is in order to shelve it. But some people who read him would read anything by him, no matter where it was shelved. I mean, where I work in Ballyfermot, we have a certain number of genre spaces. But we also treat things like audiobooks as kind of like a genre, and we also treat large print as it's kind of like a genre. And but and we have some Westerns, and there's some people that's all they'll read. That is literally, they will go to those shelves, they will pick up the books off that shelf, and that's what they'll walk out with. It's ditto with Mills and Boons. But all we can do in shops and in libraries is to try and make it that the borrower can find, or the buyer can find what they're looking for with the greatest ease possible, and might stumble on something else that they want to read that is in a similar area. That, because it's a lot of times you'll see that people, it's not the book they're looking for that they actually want. It's a book that's very similar.
And that prompts a follow-up question. But before I get there, I'm going to go over to Conor.
So like we were chatting before we went live, I think there are major pros and cons to genre. And with regards readers knowing, like the readers I see day to day are children in school, right? And they don't know what genres really are. You really have to explicitly explain. And then you feel, then especially me, when I have a book in my hand and the kid is saying, oh, I want to read something like this, and maybe that book doesn't fit in fantasy. Like, what is a fantasy book? What defines a book as a fantasy book? What defines a book as a science fiction? What defines it as? And then, because a lot of children will say, what do you want to read? And they say, oh, I want to read a funny book. Like, okay, yeah, but like, give me something more. Do you know what I mean? Because funny isn't a genre. I mean, every single book has at least one sentence that's intended to make a reader chuckle. So does that mean every book goes into funny? You know? So it's just, it's very, I don't think readers, it's funny. I think readers need genre so that if they know a particular type of book they really, really like, that they can find it sitting amongst other books on a shelf, and they will easily access books that they enjoy. So that's the positive of genre. But then, like you had said earlier, Kathy, all of us here, we're people that are so passionate about books and reading that we will push our own boundaries. But if you have somebody that isn't as passionate and they're only pulling from the same shelf, they're missing so much if you sort really distinctly and clearly by genre. So it's this real double-edged sword, I think.
And I suppose that's a question which hasn't been provided for me, but I was thinking of, are we better able now to get past genre because of things like Goodreads, or even those Amazon recommendations of the people who bought this book also actually bought this book? And I ask this in part because, you know, I'm hearing everything everybody's saying. And I can remember my brief time in being a bookseller that people would be in and they'd be, I need a book. And you'd be like, well, what do you like? You like that book, but why did you like it? Did you like it because it had, you know, naval fightings and Napoleon? Or did you like the sort of depiction of male friendship? Or did you like, you know, the fact that you were learning this along the ways or whatever? And when you had that answer, you knew where to take them next.
Yeah, it's like, I think for me anyway, and I'm sure Deirdre and MaryBrigid will have plenty to say about that. That's the thing that's really hard to find when someone's asking for a book recommendation is, okay, the last book, like if somebody read my book, The Longest Night, they might say, oh yeah, I really like that because there's a really good crime part in it, but I wouldn't call it a crime book. But other people have, like in reviews and stuff, said really good crime thriller. And I'm like, crime thriller, there's human sacrifice and there's magical monsters in it. That's not a crime book. But to them, it was. So I think that's the thing. You just have to really, I think the best thing is think of genre as a guideline, not as a definitive box. But the problem is you still have to put the book on a shelf, don't you?
Yep. And you have to get it. You have to get it to the borrower or the buyer who wants it.
Yeah,
that's where we often end up with problems.
And Deirdre, could I ask you a question? Actually, it just popped in my head. Have you ever found? Sorry, Kathy, I'm taking over. I warned you.
No, you did warn me, and you only get to do this like twice, and then you're out.
Okay, that's fine. Right, this is number one. So, and it's for both MaryBrigid and Deirdre. Have you ever found, like, let's say a book was on a particular shelf in a particular genre because you thought it fit, but then it wasn't getting borrowed or bought so much, and then you move it to a different genre, a different shelf? Have you ever seen it affect how much a book has been borrowed or bought because of where you place it?
Yes and no.
Great.
I like that definitive answer.
Sometimes you can get a book, you can get more traction on a book if, say for example, we would often have, and we discuss it, like recommends shelves or staff recommends, you know, displays and stuff like that. And sometimes books that have been static on the shelves would then become popular because somebody sees that somebody else has enjoyed this or recommends this. And sometimes when I've moved some books from, say I moved some Ben Aronovich's from our general shelves to the science fiction and fantasy shelves, then suddenly, oh, people were starting to pick them up. But sometimes, because we've got the online catalog and things like that, people will find the book anyway and will look for it. So sometimes, and sometimes if you write, during the shutdown, we did an awful lot of reviewing and promoting of books online and stuff like that. And we've seen that that's actually got traction for some books and movement for some of them outside of what we would have thought. It was amazing how much that did it. But we also have things like resources for people like Who Else Writes Like, which would allow somebody to find an author that's quite similar to the one they're already doing, might be similar type of writing or a similar theme of writing. We subscribe to that in Dublin City Libraries. And yeah, Goodreads and Library Thing and all of those can help people find things, but they can also, some of the Amazon suggestions I get are very pigeonhole me. They don't actually use some of the things that I have said I really like. Sometimes they're suggesting books that I've, similar to ones I have 2-starred, or 3-starred. And it's like, for me, a 3-star is, yeah, that was readable, but no, if it happens across me, by me and I'm bored, I might read it, but I'm not looking for it, whereas, and they don't recommend stuff that I 4 and 5-starred, similar to those kind of things. So sometimes my ability to discover books is obscured by some of the weird algorithms they work with. But then again, I have a house full of books.
I have no idea what
and an e-reader full of books, and and I have library privileges and stuff, and lots of books out of there too. And I'm kept occupied.
Yeah.
MaryBrigid, will go to you and say, how's it working as far as getting books to those readers? Is the genre, is it easier now than it was 20 years ago? Is it less easier? Are the genres harder or looser than they used to be?
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, one of the advantages, as Conor mentioned, of being the children's bookseller is we don't have genre in the children's section. We have age groups. So all the fantasy and science fiction and whatever gets lumped together in one section called fiction. And it's by age group. But I mean, I also ran the science fiction section for me, the science fiction and fantasy section for many, many years. And it's one of my passions for reading. I used to find that if someone was asking me for a fantasy book, I'd have to ask them what kind of fantasy they wanted. Did they want high fantasy like Tolkien with elves and goblins, or did they want something with a mercenary bend like David Gemmell would be the one that I would have used at the time, probably more Joe Abercrombie these days. And just sort of to get that, because even within fantasy, you've got layers, and certainly within science fiction, you've got layers. In some respects, I kind of hate the fact that we do have it separated out, because, as you say, sometimes being able to just browse the fiction section, you come across something that you don't think that you're going to notice, or you don't realize you're going to, that author wrote those kind of books.
Shelf tidying is evil for adding books to your shelf.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And also, just touching on Conor's question, my answer would probably be very similar to Deirdre's, yes and no. The number of times I've written a shelf recommendation for something that might be a personal favorite that has sat on the shelf and not moved for 6 months, 2 years or longer, and I suddenly write a shelf recommendation for it and put it face out, showing the cover rather than just the spine, and that book will start moving. Other times I've tried it and the book has still sat there for whatever reason. I freely admit I have very eclectic tastes. I think anyone who reads books has eclectic tastes. But yeah, as much as I consider myself a genre reader, it's also one of the pitfalls of being a reader, because you can be limited. And sometimes you limit yourself because you go to that genre section because you know that's the kind of books or authors that you like reading. So you might not browse the general fiction shelves, and you might not discover. Kurt Vonnegut, for example, I was recommended by somebody years ago. He had never crossed my radar before because he usually always got shelved in general fiction or literary fiction. I avoid literary fiction like the plague because I've read some really bad stuff that I didn't like. Not that it was bad books, I just didn't like it. So I would very rarely browse a literary fiction section. I would head straight to a science fiction section and find what I was familiar with. But it also meant that I was missing out on great authors. So it's a two-edged sword. It really is a two-edged sword.
I have a particular dislike of the term literary fiction because I'm not quite sure when you get to be literary.
When you win awards but don't make money.
Well, there is that. There is that. I mean, I figure as soon as you win a Nobel Prize for Literature, you're literary. But other than that, there's really...
or when you get shortlisted for awards.
You do, but as I say, shortlisted, I can remember reading some of the Booker long list once and thinking, I mean, they were great books, but, nobody's going to put them in literary fiction.
No, I'm not talking about the long lists, because I've seen the long list as well for the Dublin Literary Award. The long lists often have all sorts of eclectic stuff in it.
Oh, great stuff.
Some great stuff as well, and some stuff I've enjoyed and read, and I always read the long list. But by the time it gets to the short list, before they start awarding the prize, then once they hit that short list, they're probably literary fiction.
Yeah, that's true. I would agree with that, definitely.
It's almost like a list of, okay, I'm not reading these.
Nobody's taking this book to the beach.
No. I mean, I have read some of the award winners for the Dublin Literary Award because we get tons of them. Some of them have been great reads, but some of them it's been like 50 pages in, I'm going, no, life too short, gone. Send it back. I have a tendency for a 50-page nope.
The 50-page nope. I'm gonna remember that now next time I'm writing a book. I'll be like, if it's not good by page 50.
Well, it's actually Nancy Pearl, who's a librarian, a retired librarian, I think, at this stage in the US, who said that you should give a book a chance, and about 50 pages is about a good chance for most books. But if after 50 pages you actually don't like it, you should have the right to stop.
I very rarely abandon books, and I have lived to regret it.
Yeah. I think there's two types of books that you shouldn't be reading right now. There's the book that it's the wrong time for you to read it.
Yep.
Because you're not in the right place to get the best out of that book. And then there's the book that is not for you. It's not written for you. You're not its audience. It might be a wonderful book, but you're not, you and it, nah.
Yeah.
No, just let it go. Give it to a better home. You probably know somebody for whom this is the perfect book.
I'd like to think I don't have those people in my life, but that's a different.
You can have family who like it, or you could have a secondhand bookstore as another person that you can send it to.
Secondhand bookstore would probably have
Charity bookstore is also recycling. Sometimes is the place that book needs to be.
I'm terrified now because I'm sitting here and with being the author on the panel. I'm like, oh God, please don't let my book be the one that becomes hamster bedding.
Yes, but the hamster will really, really love it.
I was going to say, I mean, we're completely going off panel, and nobody's ever going to ask me to moderate again. But my problem is, I mean, there have been a few books I haven't finished. There's been definitely one book I finished and threw across the room because I couldn't believe I'd spent so much time reading the book and it did nothing for me. But there's a lot of books that I read and I think, really, I've just spent this time reading this book and I'm not going to get it back. Why didn't I read a better book? But that's, yeah.
Sometimes that's you're finding out that that author and you are not a good mix.
Yep.
And it's a good time to note that that is not your author, or possibly that series is not your author series. Because I've hit that with some authors where one series is amazing and really, really speaks to me. And then another series, it's like, nope, moving on. Let's not read that again. But, you know, I mean, and then I've finished books where it's book one in a series and I've asked myself the serious question, do you want to read more in that series? And it's like, no, actually, no. Maybe if I have to, because it's, you know, it comes up in the Hugos or something like that. But, and even then I'd be a bit reluctant, but like, you know, it's like, no, I've got older and I've got to the stage where it's like, I don't have to read these books. I'm not going to be examined on these books, you know, and anyone who wants to examine me on these books, like, they really need a better hobby, you know. You know, definitely. I read hundreds. I mean, I read literally over 100 books a year. I am I excessively read. So, you know, if one book in that 100 is going to be like a book I don't finish, it's like nobody's going to notice. Out of the hundreds I do. I mean, I did a list on the recommendations thing of all the books I think were pretty standout last year, and it was pretty long.
I saw it. I made the mistake of looking at it. I wish I had.
Last time I visited MaryBrigid, I walked out with 2 books. She walked out with 2 books I handed her.
This is true. This is very true.
Evil enabler. That's what I've been called.
But
I've been called a book witch.
I love that title. Sorry.
The book witch is fantastic.
I like that one too.
Listening to Deirdre really quite reassuring in a way. And again, why have a panel on the topic when instead you can counsel me? One of my great frustrations in life is that people will not give me books. All the people I love in my life do not give me books.
Oh, be thankful for that. My mother gives me books every Christmas.
And then you have to read them. And then you feel bad when you start reading them. You're like, this is a bit shite. This is not my kind of book. Last
year's one was book 2 in a series. But I hadn't read book 1.
Oh no.
Was it any good?
The number of, I'm not a horror reader. I am really not a horror reader. But the number of Stephen Kings this bookseller has sold my mother. Seriously? Really? I want to have a serious talk with this bookseller and go,
stop, please.
You need to have a little breath here of, this person is a fantasy reader. Sell my mother better books. You know, I'm sorry. Like, you know, you're not doing your job here. I'm a professional. I know. You know, but I mean, she gives me these eclectic books that she's trying very hard to convert me from fantasy and science fiction. And she's a literary reader but she's a person who only ever reads a book once, whereas I'll often read books several times if I really like them. Again, ridiculous reading speed, read too many books. I probably have forgotten middle parts of the book anyway. And sometimes the conclusion of several books. So, but like, there's times that I'm kind of going, could you just give me vouchers? It'd make my life, you know, I could buy the things I want to buy.
Yep.
But she keeps trying to expand my horizons. I'm going, my horizons, they're pretty broad.
Could I, Kathy, can I do it again? Can this be my second time?
This is your second. Go for it. Because I must admit, I think I've completely lost any discipline I was attempting to bring, and it's my fault, nobody else's. It's just anarchy in the panel. Let's talk.
To be honest, now that I've met and talked to MaryBrigid and Deirdre, and I know myself, I don't think you ever had a chance. No fault here. So my question is, what's the book that you read? What's a book that you read that you knew was going to be way out of your comfort zone, and you're kind of like, ugh, whatever, I'll just give this a go, and then you're like, wow, this is really good. Because for me, I'm not a big historical fiction person at all. I don't like anyone that I've attempted to read. I kind of get to around page 50 actually, probably, and then go, nah, no. But then my dad gave me the book that I was named after the main character of. So like, yeah, I know Conor, very common name, but I was actually named after the main character of Trinity by Leon Uris. Huge book, really good, really long. So like I read it because I felt like I had to, because he gave it to me as a Christmas present, and it was the book he was reading when I was born, and I absolutely loved it. It's the book that for me made me go, I really have to start reading outside my comfort zone more often. So like, what was the one for you guys that was the book that made you realize that?
Before you answer that, I'm going to say A, I've been given a 2-minute warning. So give us your answer and plug whatever you want to plug. And B, Trinity may be one of the reasons why I've ended up in Northern Ireland.
Okay. Me next.
Deirdre, go for it.
This year it was Leonard and Hungry Paul. By Ronan Mullen, I think is the name of the author. It was the One Dublin One book, which meant like basically I was obliged to kind of at least try to read it. And I actually really, really enjoyed it. I found it a really interesting story, and it's completely not fantasy and science fiction. It's a very gentle. It's one of those books I normally don't like and avoid like the plague. That's a slice of life story, but it had a certain amount of positivity that was involved in it that's not often common in those. And it was just like one of those stories that you were finished reading and went, actually, yes, I quite enjoyed that. And it was completely outside of my usual genres. And I wouldn't have read it if it wasn't a One City, One book, if I'm honest.
MaryBrigid, take us out.
For me, Paulina Simon's 11 Hours. It's a contemporary fiction book. Takes place in a shopping mall. It's about a pregnant woman, and something happens, and she's got her underlying health conditions, and they've literally got 11 hours to get to her. There's a hostage situation. Someone robs the shop, and they're a hostage situation because of this underlying condition that she's got. They've got 11 hours to get medical aid to her so she doesn't either lose her life or lose the baby. And I couldn't put it down. Someone told me the premise of it. I'm like, you're kidding me. This is not going to be good. I'm going to read 5 pages and throw it away. I loved the whole thing. It was brilliant.
Conor, you get the last word, because you have a book, The Longest Night. You have another book coming out?
I do. Oh no, that didn't work. There it is. There's The Longest Night by me. We were talking about the thing, and I actually have the genre on the front cover to really help people find it. It's a supernatural thriller. I also have a podcast, Story of a Storyteller, where I interview other authors and talk to them about their life's work and also how they ended up being an author. And actually, that's where I get most of my books now. I end up falling in love with the author and be like, oh, I have to read your book now. And I think that's why my thing is so wide. So Story of a Storyteller.
Don't you think, as a good questioner, you should have read the books first? You're not doing your prep.
No, I am, because the podcast is called Story of a Storyteller. So it's all about the author. And that way I don't have to read every single book and, be able to do a podcast as well.
Well, I want to say thank you to the panel. You may have noticed that unfortunately Fabio had to leave us because he was having broadband issues. I've had a fantastic time. I don't know if anybody will ever allow me back, but I'm kind of hoping that, we can have a panel reunion tour next year at Octocon. Oh, and if I was really good, I would have a schedule up of what's happening next and telling you where to go. But this is virtual conferences working much better than I expected. And go read books and appreciate your librarians and booksellers and podcasters who help you find great books.